Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Ashford called her in the supply closet last week when she questioned his delayed response time during the code blue in the ICU. The words hung in the fluorescent-lit air like something toxic. Katie Morrison didn't flinch. She never flinched anymore. The thing was, he had no idea who he was looking at. He had no idea that the woman restocking fur lines with surgical precision had once held a battlefield together with nothing but field dressings and sheer force of will. The faded unit patch sewn inside the lining of her jacket, a combat medical badge from operations that officially never happened, rested against her ribs like a secret that could end careers. She moved through Seattle General in Norfolk with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd been ordered to disappear. Her scrubs were navy blue, unremarkable, the kind that every third person in the hospital wore. Her name badge read K. Morrison, RN in clinical block letters. Nothing mentioned that her first name was Katherine. Nothing mentioned Major. Nothing mentioned Ramadi, or the 6 years she'd spent running combat trauma operations in the most dangerous city in Iraq, or the fact that she'd been officially declared KIA to protect an asset extraction that saved 200 lives. The military had erased her existence so thoroughly that even the Pentagon files listed her as a casualty. Dead and gone. Mission compartmentalized. Case closed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that low mechanical whine that became white noise after enough years in hospitals. Katie checked the overnight patients with movements that were ghost-like, efficient, economical. Every motion served a purpose. No wasted energy. No unnecessary conversation. She moved through the corridors of the surgical wing like water finding its path, quiet, persistent, impossible to stop once momentum was established. The antiseptic smell of the ward mixed with something sharper, chemical, like someone had spilled a bottle of hand sanitizer near the medication dispensary. Her forearms bore scars that traced upward like a roadmap of places the military pretended didn't exist, thin white lines that disappeared under her scrub sleeves. In bed 7, Sergeant Marcus Chen lay recovering from shrapnel wounds sustained during a training accident 3 weeks ago. His left leg was wrapped in compression bandaging. His right arm had been through 3 surgeries. But it was his eyes that told the real story, eyes that tracked movement with the hypervigilance of someone who'd spent years knowing that stillness meant death. When Katie approached to check his vitals, his attention shifted to her with an intensity that made the air in the room change pressure. She felt it before she understood it, that sudden weight of recognition from a man she'd never met. She didn't know his name yet. The chart said M. Chen, Petty Officer, USN, but that meant nothing to her. She'd worked with hundreds of military patients over the years. They all had that same look, the 1,000-yard stare, the way they flinched at unexpected sounds, the way they watched doors and windows like threats might emerge at any moment. Katie reached for the blood pressure cuff and he watched her hands. That was when it happened. His eyes widened fractionally, just enough that someone paying attention would have noticed. Someone paying attention. "You're from Ramadi," he said. Not a question. Katie's hands didn't pause as she wrapped the cuff around his arm. The Velcro made a soft tearing sound. "I'm your nurse this morning, Petty Officer Chen. Let's get your vitals." 2003, the burning vehicle en route Michigan. His voice was lower now, rough with something that might have been recognition or might have been shock. "You pulled me out. I was 7 years old. I remember your face." She didn't look at him. The blood pressure cuff inflated with a hiss of air, the pressure building against his arm. "You're remembering someone else." But even as she said it, she could feel him staring at her, trying to match the memory from 20 years ago to the woman standing beside his bed. The numbers climbed on the monitor. 118/74. Normal. Steady. Like her voice. Like her hands. Like everything about Katie Morrison was designed to reveal nothing. The thing about carrying secrets was that they became invisible after enough time. You stopped thinking about them the way other people stopped thinking about their breathing, automatic, subliminal, so deeply embedded in the architecture of who you were that pretending to be ordinary didn't require effort anymore. It required nothing. You were nothing. You were a nurse named Kay Morrison who kept her eyes down during rounds and spoke only when necessary and made sure that every patient got the care they needed regardless of what waited for her in the parking lot at the end of the shift. 30 seconds later, Katie finished with his vitals and moved to the next patient. Behind her, she could hear Petty Officer Chen's breathing change. She didn't look back. Dr. Richard Ashford arrived for morning rounds at 7:13 a.m., which was 13 minutes earlier than his usual time. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a shine that reflected the fluorescent lights like mirrors. He carried a tablet that contained the overnight reports and a demeanor that suggested he was doing the nursing staff a favor by allowing them to exist in his presence. He was tall, with a kind of jawline that might have been handsome if it didn't suggest a man who'd spent his entire adult life looking down at people. His watch was a Rolex, silver and gold, the kind that whispered money and status to anyone who knew how to listen. Katie was in the medication dispensary when he arrived on the surgical wing, preparing a 14-gauge full line for a post-op patient in Bedford who had a hematoma that needed monitoring. Her movements were precise and practiced. She'd inserted thousands of fours over her career. The needle went in at a precise angle, the catheter threaded smoothly into the vein without rolling or infiltrating the surrounding tissue. She secured it with a small piece of tape and labeled the port with the time and date in her careful handwriting. 7:52 a.m. What she didn't know was that Dr. Ashford had paused in the doorway and was watching her work. What she didn't know was that her competence, her visible command of a procedure that most nurses required 2 or 3 attempts to complete successfully, had just registered as a threat to a man who'd built his entire career on the principle that hierarchy was inviolable. That only doctors understood complex medical procedures. That nurses followed protocols and doctors made decisions. That nurses stayed in their place. He'd been reviewing the code blue incident from the previous afternoon, the one where Katie had noted that his response time, the time between when the patient arrested and when Dr. Ashford actually arrived in the ICU, had been 18 minutes. 18 minutes during which a patient's brain had been deprived of oxygen. A patient who'd ultimately survived, yes, but only because Katie had initiated the code herself and maintained CPR with textbook precision until he'd finally appeared. He'd been in the physician's lounge. He'd been reviewing lab results on a patient in the orthopedic wing. There had been delays. And Katie had seen those delays. Had documented them, not in a formal complaint, but in a casual observation that had somehow made its way to the nursing supervisor. Which meant that nurses were now noticing his timing. Which meant that his authority, the thing he'd built across 32 years at Seattle General, was being questioned by someone in blue scrubs. He'd made the decision that moment, watching her secure the full line with a surgeon's precision that shouldn't have belonged to a nurse. This one would have to be neutralized. Not aggressively. Dr. Ashford had learned long ago that aggression left evidence. He would be subtle. He would be strategic. He would remove her from his operating room's orbit so thoroughly that by the time she realized what was happening, her reputation would already be in pieces. But that wasn't the worst part. What Dr. Ashford didn't know was that Sergeant Marcus Chen was lying in bed 7 with recognition burning through his mind like a code that wouldn't decrypt. The field medic from 20 years ago. The woman who'd pulled him from a burning Humvee outside Fallujah. The woman whose face he'd thought about for 2 decades without knowing why. He was making a phone call. Not immediately. Not during morning rounds. But later. When he was alone. When the lines were secure. He was going to make a phone call that would change everything about what Dr. Ashford thought he knew about the invisible nurse in blue scrubs. Katie moved through the corridors of Seattle General with the precision of someone who had learned long ago that invisibility was a survival skill. Her scrubs were immaculate. Her badge hung at exactly the right angle. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of 2 decades of battlefield medicine, now translated into the mundane choreography of civilian nursing, adjusting full lines, checking vitals, documenting observations that no one asked for and fewer still believed. The hospital hummed around her, fluorescent lights casting everyone in the same institutional pallor, and she had become so practiced at disappearing that most staff members couldn't describe her face if asked. But Dr. Ashford had noticed her. Not as a nurse. As a threat. Room for 12 was where the Hendersons had gathered, 6 family members arranged around their father's hospital bed like mourners at a wake, though the 84-year-old man still had a pulse and the will to complain about the food. Katie had been adjusting his morphine drip when she noticed the subtle signs, the increasing pressure in his calf, the warmth radiating from his lower leg, the way he winced when she palpated the compartment. She had documented it carefully, patient presenting signs consistent with compartment syndrome. Recommend surgical evaluation. It was a routine observation. It was the kind of thing a good nurse caught before it became a crisis. It was also the kind of thing that made Dr. Ashford look away from his phone. He entered room for 12 with the momentum of someone accustomed to parting crowds, his white coat moving like a sail, residents trailing behind him in formation. His eyes found Katie first, registered her presence, and then performed a calculation she could see happening behind his pupils, an assessment of whether this moment could be weaponized. She finished documenting the morphine dose and turned to face him, her expression perfectly neutral. "Nurse Morrison," he said, and the tone of his voice made the Henderson family turn their attention from their father to the confrontation unfolding beside the bed. "Perhaps you can explain to this family why you felt qualified to recommend a surgical consult yesterday." His smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes. It was a smile that had dissolved the careers of 3 nurses in the past 18 months. Katie's voice remained steady. The patient showed signs of compartment syndrome. The calf pressure reading support. "And where exactly did you get your medical degree?" Ashford's voice cut through hers like a scalpel, and he didn't wait for an answer. His eyes moved to the family with practiced sympathy. "A nursing certificate from a community program, I'm afraid. Not the kind of training that qualifies one to make diagnostic recommendations." He turned back to Katie. "Your job is to empty bedpans and follow orders, night shift. Not to play doctor." The nickname landed like a physical blow, reducing her to a shift assignment, a thing rather than a person, and Katie felt something tighten in her chest like a fist. But she didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She took one measured breath, let a single tear threaten behind her eyes and then blinked it away without breaking eye contact with Ashford. The family shifted uncomfortably. The attending physician who had arrived with Ashford suddenly became very interested in the patient's chart. Katie kept her hand steady on the 4 line. The patient's pressure reading supported the assessment. "Doctor," she said quietly. Ashford's smile widened, the smile of a predator who had scented blood. He turned to the family with a shrug that was meant to communicate sympathy and exasperation in equal measure, as if they were all reasonable people dealing with an unreasonable employee. Then he left the room, and his residents trailed after him like pilot fish following a shark, and the family looked at Katie with a kind of pity that was worse than anger because it meant they had believed him. 2 days later, Katie entered the break room at 6:22 a.m. with a lunch she had packed the night before, a turkey sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water, and set it on the table by the window. Dr. Chen, an attending who had nodded at her in the hallway 3 times that month, looked up from his coffee, met her eyes for a fraction of a second, and then stood. He picked up his cup and walked out without speaking. Then Nurse Patricia, who had once borrowed Katie's stethoscope. Then the resident. Then a hospital chaplain Katie had never spoken to but who apparently understood the social calculus of ostracism. Within 30 seconds, the break room was empty except for Katie and her sandwich. This pattern repeated for 7 days. The break room emptying when she entered became as predictable as the automated medication dispensers, as reliable as the ventilator sounds drifting from the ICU. By Friday, Katie no longer tried. She ate in her car. She drank her coffee in the supply room. She became a ghost moving through halls that had become actively hostile to her presence, and she did this with the same calm that had kept her alive in Ramadi when the city burned around her and every shadow held a threat. On Friday afternoon, Katie walked past the unit board where schedules and announcements and nurse updates were posted under the fluorescent lights, and her breath caught. A white sheet of paper had been affixed with clinical precision to the center of the board. At the top, printed in Ashford's formal administrative handwriting, Nurse K.M. Morrison, written warning for protocol violation, overstepping scope of practice, insubordination, failure to maintain chain of command. The specifics were vague enough to be undisprovable, detailed enough to seem legitimate. A medication dose questioned, without naming which medication or when. A recommendation made to a patient, without specifying which patient or what was recommended. A failure to follow proper channels, without defining what channels or what proper procedure meant. It was a masterpiece of administrative sabotage, the kind of document that sounded devastating when spoken aloud to a disciplinary committee but held no actual provable claims. Katie read it 3 times, her hand steady, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the board. Then she turned and walked to the supply room, locked the door, and sat on a stack of gauze packages in the darkness for 4 minutes. Just for minutes. Then she stood, straightened her scrubs, checked her reflection in the polished metal door to confirm her composure was intact, and returned to her rounds. But the walls were closing in. Katie's access badge no longer opened the supply room, the lock had been changed, and she had to request items from whoever was working registration, had to wait, had to explain herself. Her login credentials for the digital charting system were flagged as under review, which meant she couldn't access patient records without supervision, couldn't document her own observations, had become a liability even in the eyes of the hospital's software. When she requested a meeting with Human Resources, the administrator had smiled apologetically and said, "Dr. Ashford filed some concerns about your performance last week. We're reviewing those first." The message was clear, the machinery had been activated. Behind closed doors, Ashford continued his calculated work with the precision of someone playing chess. He called the chief nursing officer, "I need Morrison off my unit. Liability risk." He wrote her into the schedule for solo shifts during the hardest hours, midnight to 6 a.m. with no backup when staffing was minimal and any crisis would fall entirely on her shoulders. He reassigned Nurse Patricia to the pediatric floor and Dr. Chen to the evening shift, methodically separating Katie from the 2 people who might have offered even silent solidarity. He had lunch with 2 board members on Thursday, leaning across the table with his voice dropped low, nurses who don't understand boundaries. Who think they're physicians? It's a patient safety issue, really. His campaign was professional, methodical, devastating, the kind of slow institutional strangulation that left no visible marks. Then came the email. Katie discovered it at 11:34 p.m. while completing her shift notes, a message that had been sent to administration with the subject line "Formal Recommendation for Termination." Attached were fabricated incident reports, a medication error from 6 months ago that had never occurred, falsified complaint forms, manufactured witnesses to violations that existed only in Ashford's carefully constructed narrative. Each document looked authentic. Each had the right official header, the right formatting, the right timestamps. His case was airtight. His documentation was impeccable. She was a dead woman walking, and she knew it. In Bed 7, Sergeant Marcus Chen had been watching all of this unfold with the focused intensity of someone trained to read situations and predict outcomes. His left leg was healing. The burns on his shoulder were responding to treatment. But his attention was fixed on the nurse who moved through the unit like a ghost, and on the surgical chief who treated her like something he had scraped from his shoe. One night when Katie was checking his vitals, blood pressure 132/88, heart rate steady at 72, oxygen saturation 98%, Chen spoke quietly, his voice like gravel beneath snow. "Ramadi," he said. 2003, burning vehicle. I was 7 years old. Katie's hands froze on the blood pressure cuff. Her pupils dilated, and for exactly 2 seconds, her composure fractured like old glass. Then she rebuilt it, muscle by muscle, breath by breath, until her face was smooth again and her voice was steady. "I think you have me confused with someone else, Sergeant." "I never forget a face," Chen said. "Especially not the one that pulled me out of that fire." Katie finished documenting his vitals without responding. She turned and left his room, and she did not return until her shift ended, and when she sat in her car in the parking lot at 6:24 a.m. with the rain hammering the windshield like applause for something she had not accomplished, she understood that she was about to lose everything she had built in this civilian life. The quiet. The invisibility. The chance to be nobody important. The ability to hide. And she had no idea that Sergeant Chen had followed her out to that parking lot, had watched her drive away, and had already reached for his phone. The phone call came at 6:33 a.m., before Katie had finished her shift report. Dr. Ashford's voice carried the practiced concern of a man who had perfected the art of institutional assassination, smooth, regretful, absolutely lethal. He was calling the chief nursing officer, Patricia Brennan, a woman who had held her position for 19 years and had learned long ago that survival meant staying out of conflicts between physicians and staff. Katie didn't hear the call directly, but she learned about it the way bad news always travels in hospitals, through whispers, through the sudden silence when she entered the break room, through the careful way people stopped mid-sentence and looked at their phones instead of her eyes. What the chief nursing officer heard was this: Dr. Ashford had documented a pattern. Insubordination, certainly, but more than that, a liability risk. A nurse who questioned orders in front of patients. A nurse whose informal medical background had led her to make observations beyond her scope of practice. He wasn't angry about it, he explained to Patricia. He was concerned. For patient safety. For the hospital's legal exposure. For Katie's own well-being, really, if she continued down this path. The chief nursing officer listened and said nothing, which was exactly what Dr. Ashford wanted her to do. Silence meant assent. Silence meant the machinery was already in motion. By 8:15 a.m., nurses Derek Collins and Sarah Martinez received their reassignment letters. Both had been caught standing near Katie's locker yesterday. Both had smiled at her in the hallway. Both had the misfortune of representing what Dr. Ashford feared most: solidarity. Derek, who had worked pediatrics for 7 years and was beloved by every parent on his unit, was being transferred to night shift in the dialysis center, a rotation that would destroy his family schedule and his standing among the day shift nursing hierarchy. Sarah, a critical care specialist with a reputation for excellence, was being reassigned to an administrative role processing discharge paperwork, a career move designed to feel like promotion while systematically removing her from the unit and from Katie's proximity. The paperwork cited staffing needs and unit balance, but everyone on the floor knew what it really meant. The message was clear: stand with Morrison and you will be moved. Dr. Ashford was rewriting the unit's social topology one transfer at a time. Katie watched this unfold with the detached observation of someone who had spent 20 years reading battle spaces, identifying threats, calculating casualties. She didn't react when Derek was told his new rotation started immediately. She didn't acknowledge Sarah's stricken face when she learned she'd been promoted off the floor. She simply continued her work, charting vitals, adjusting drips, cleaning instruments with the methodical precision that had kept her invisible for so long. But her hands, those hands that had performed emergency cricothyrotomies in the rubble of Fallujah with rounds snapping overhead, those hands were now very, very still. The conference room meeting had been scheduled for 10:02 a.m. Katie found out at 10 o'clock when Patricia appeared at the nursing station and said, "Katie, could you join us in Conference B for a few minutes?" There was no anger in her voice, which made it worse. Anger implied she had chosen a side. This was the tone of someone following a script she hadn't written. The room smelled like industrial coffee and air conditioning. 3 people sat at the table: Patricia Brennan, whose face was a careful blank, Michael Chen from Human Resources, a man Katie had spoken to exactly once, at her initial orientation 6 years ago, and Dr. Ashford, who was already arranging his expression into an approximation of genuine concern. Outside the conference room door, standing with the posture of someone trained in observation and restraint, a security officer waited. Just visible enough to be a promise. Just present enough to ensure no scene would be made. "Nurse Morrison," Dr. Ashford began, and his voice carried the tonality of a surgeon about to deliver a terminal diagnosis, regretful, certain, and absolutely without negotiation. "We've completed our review of the incidents from the past 72 hours. Your pattern of insubordination and protocol violations has left us no choice but to proceed with immediate termination of employment." The folder slid across the table like an accusation written in paper. Katie didn't open it. She didn't need to. She knew what was inside, the write-up from the code blue, annotated with observations about her overreach. The patient complaint Dr. Ashford had fabricated, signed by a family member who had never once complained about her care. The documentation of her repeated questioning of physician authorities during rounds. The clinical notes highlighting her suggestions as examples of scope creep. It was a masterpiece of institutional poisoning, all true details arranged to mean something entirely false, like rearranging the furniture in a room to make it feel like a prison. Katie sat perfectly still for 3 heartbeats. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed like an insect trapped in glass. One tear escaped her right eye, not from sadness, but from the sheer metabolic cost of holding 18 years of buried rage behind a civilian smile. She wiped it away with her index finger, never breaking eye contact with Dr. Ashford. When she spoke, her voice had dropped a register, and the sound of it made Patricia Brennan's pen stop mid-note. "You have no idea who you're looking at, Doctor." Ashford's smile widened. This was what he wanted, the moment of breaking. The moment when the quiet woman finally cracked, gave him something to document, something to justify. His response came with the confidence of a man who had spent 48 years never being contradicted by anyone who mattered. "I know exactly what I'm looking at. Someone who forgot her place." Michael Chen from HR shifted in his chair, suddenly uncomfortable with the texture of what was happening in the room. Katie had never raised her voice. She had never threatened. She had simply stated a fact in a voice that suggested she was looking at Dr. Ashford through a rifle scope. The termination papers were extensive. 23 pages of fabricated evidence, carefully organized into a narrative of professional incompetence. Katie read every word. Her signature on the final page was steady, the penmanship of someone whose hands had logged 300,000 medical procedures across 2 decades and could hold a line through anything. She signed her name as Katherine Morrison, using the formal first name she hadn't heard spoken in 6 years. The pen didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She stood without being dismissed. The security officer stepped forward reflexively, but Katie had already begun walking toward the door with the measured pace of someone accustomed to moving through hostile territory. She didn't acknowledge Patricia Brennan's apologetic glance. She didn't respond to Michael Chen's uncomfortable throat clear. Dr. Ashford remained seated, already composing the email he would send to his board allies, already rewriting the narrative into a story about a difficult staff member and appropriate professional boundaries. In bed 7 of the cardiac recovery unit, Sergeant Marcus Chen watched her walk past the window of his room, watched the unit's charge nurse intercept her with a sympathetic expression, watched her decline whatever was being offered with a single shake of her head. His hands, scarred from 17 years of SEAL team operations, began to tremble. Not from pain, his chest wound was nearly healed. Not from fear. Marcus Chen had jumped out of helicopters in weather that would ground civilian aircraft. But his hands trembled because he had just watched someone save his life turn around and be discarded by the institution that should have treasured her like a national resource. He reached for his phone with trembling fingers and scrolled to a number he hadn't dialed in 8 years. A number that should have been deleted. A number that existed only in the encrypted contacts of his phone, labeled with a single letter, X. In the parking lot, Katie loaded the contents of her locker into her personal vehicle, a 2008 Dodge Durango with reinforced suspension and a diagnostic scanner mounted under the dash, old habits that never quite left her bones. The photograph of her husband in dress uniform went into a cardboard box. A few medical reference texts. A jacket she had owned for 19 years, its lining carefully stitched with a faded unit patch from the 75th Ranger Regiment, the insignia of her old life made small enough to hide in plain sight. She had broken protocol wearing it. She had violated every regulation by keeping it. And now she was loading it into a vehicle alongside her terminated employment papers like artifacts from an archaeological site of her own life. The dispatcher on her old scanner, a habit from her SEAL team days that she had never quite abandoned, keeping a portable unit in her car for reasons she never articulated to herself, exploded with activity at 10:52 a.m. Multiple units. Training accident. 12 critical patients. Multiple gunshot wounds and blast injuries. All Navy SEAL personnel en route to Seattle General. Katie's hands went white-knuckled on the steering wheel. She had been driving away from the hospital for exactly 8 minutes. She knew what would happen next. She knew the progression of triage, the cascade of decisions, the moment when Dr. Ashford would stand in the trauma bay and realize that some situations required knowledge he didn't possess and hands steadier than his own. The scanner crackled again, and dispatch confirmed it: all available trauma surgeons, all critical care staff, to the emergency department. Dr. Ashford to Trauma Bay 1. Katie's foot eased off the accelerator. The vehicle coasted across 3 lanes of traffic toward the exit ramp that would take her back toward Norfolk's shoreline, toward Seattle General's rotating red lights, toward a decision she had made 48 hours ago would never come again. She had promised someone, a long time ago in the dark of a hospital tent in Ramadi, that she would keep her head down. That she would stay invisible. That no one would ever know. But the scanner was still talking, and with every transmission, Katie heard the sound of 12 people about to die at the hands of a surgeon who had spent his career being competent at everything except the things that actually mattered. The vehicle turned onto the access road. The announcement came during shift change, when the break room was full and no one could avoid hearing it. Dr. Ashford stood in the center of the unit with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture projecting the kind of authority that came from 15 years of never being questioned. Security stood by the door. Katie was still wearing her scrubs, still had her badge clipped to her pocket, still believed the paperwork might be fixable if she just explained things clearly enough. Effective immediately, Ashford said, his voice carrying the rehearsed cadence of someone who'd practiced this speech in his office mirror: "We are terminating the employment of Katherine Morrison for repeated insubordination and violation of hospital protocol. Her shift is complete. She will collect her personal belongings under supervision and exit the premises." The room didn't go silent so much as it compressed, everyone suddenly very aware of the air they were taking up, the space they occupied, the choice to be present for this particular humiliation. A monitor beeped somewhere down the hall. A door click closed in the distance. Katie didn't move. She didn't move because moving would mean accepting the narrative, would mean her body agreeing with the verdict before her mind had finished processing it. So she stood in the center of the break room, surrounded by colleagues who wouldn't meet her eyes, and she took one measured breath. Then she let a single tear escape. It fell without a sound, traced the line of her cheekbone, and she wiped it away before it could reach her jaw. Her eyes never left Ashford's. The contact held for 3 full seconds, long enough for everyone watching to understand that something had just shifted in the room's center of gravity. "You have no idea who you're looking at, Doctor," Katie said. Her voice was quiet. Her voice was steady. Her voice sounded like someone who'd given orders in situations where the wrong word cost lives. Ashford's jaw tightened. He looked away first. Security walked her to her locker while the rest of the shift pretended to focus on charts and medication cards. She had a gym bag under her locker, change of clothes, toiletries, nothing personal except the faded unit patch sewn inside the jacket lining, threads coming loose after 20 years, the emblem of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines barely visible under the stitching. She didn't touch it. Didn't acknowledge it. Just closed the locker and walked toward the exit with the security guard 3 steps behind. The automatic doors slid open. November air hit her face. The parking lot stretched out in the late afternoon light, cars arranged in rows like soldiers standing at attention, and Katie Morrison, Major Katherine Morrison, callsign Nightingale, officially deceased since 2008, walked to her 2014 Honda Civic and drove home. 3 hours later, her police scanner was still on because old habits never died, because some part of her brain that had been trained to process radio traffic at the speed of thought never actually turned off. The scanner crackled at 4:33 p.m. All available units respond. Multiple casualties reported. Seattle General receiving incoming. 12 patients, critical trauma. Training accident at Naval Station Norfolk. Patients inbound via ground transport, ETA 8 minutes. 12 patients. Critical trauma. Naval Station Norfolk. Katie's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Units responding, be advised. Patients are Navy SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. Multiple GSWs and blast trauma. Stand by for additional casualties. She was 2 miles away. Incoming report, Trauma Bay is prepped. All surgical teams standing by. Level 1 protocols activated. 2 miles. 8 minutes. The math was simple. Katie pulled a hard left at the next intersection, tires squealing against asphalt, and turned the car around. She was back at Seattle General in 6 minutes, pulling into the emergency entrance where the security guard, the same one who'd escorted her out 3 hours ago, was standing with his arms crossed, watching the entrance like a man who'd already made a decision about what he would and wouldn't see. He saw Katie. He saw her walking toward the doors. And then he looked deliberately away, his gaze sliding to the parking lot as if she were invisible, a ghost, nothing that required acknowledgement or intervention. The emergency department was chaos. 12 gurneys. 12 SEALs in tactical gear soaked with blood. The smell hit her first, copper and burnt fabric and antiseptic and something else underneath it, the acrid bite of explosive residue that no amount of industrial cleaning could fully mask. Trauma bays that normally contained 1 or 2 critical patients now held 4, 5, 6, doctors moving in controlled panic, nurses calling vitals that climbed and dropped and climbed again, the sound of it all compressed into a roar that had weight. Dr. Ashford stood in the center of Trauma Bay 2, frozen. A Navy SEAL lay on the gurney in front of him, a man with captain's bars on his collar and a chest wound that was pumping blood with each heartbeat, the kind of wound that needed an OR immediately, needed surgical team immediately, needed someone to know what they were doing immediately. Dr. Ashford's hands hovered 6 inches above the wound. His mouth was open. His eyes had the glazed quality of someone whose training had prepared him for many things, but not this, not the sound, not the smell, not the reality of a human being dying in front of him while the rest of the hospital screamed around him. Katie didn't ask permission. Didn't clear her throat. Didn't wait for anyone to recognize her or welcome her or acknowledge that she was in the room. She walked to her car in the parking lot, opened the trunk, and pulled out the tackle kit, red nylon bag, worn soft with age, full of tools that hadn't been touched in 3 years but that she cleaned and sharpened on the 15th of every month out of habit, out of ritual, out of a sense that someday, somehow, they might matter again. The combat knife was at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, the handle worn smooth from hands that had been younger then, steadier then, certain of their purpose in ways that civilian life never allowed. She wrapped it in her palm and walked back into Seattle General. The trauma bay was exactly where she'd left it, worse, because the SEAL's oxygen saturation had dropped from 89 to 72, because the bleeding wasn't slowing, because the window between salvageable and gone was closing with every heartbeat she could hear from 20 feet away. Katie moved to the gurney. The resident standing there, a young man, early 30s, with beads of sweat on his forehead, started to turn, started to say something about restricted access, but Katie's movement was so precise, so economical, so utterly certain that his brain didn't catch up to it until she was already making the incision. Intercostal space. Just the way her hands remembered. Rib spreaders. The metal sang a high note as she opened the chest cavity. Blood spilled across the sterile field like water, like the laws of surgery had suddenly been repealed by something more fundamental than protocol. "Get me a cross-clamp," Katie said. Her voice had changed. The timid nurse was gone. This voice had ordered corpsmen and made battlefield decisions and carried the authority of someone who'd done this in sandstorms and moonlight and the worst hours of other people's lives. The resident handed her the clamp without question. The SEAL's heart was visible now, the source of the bleeding obvious, the left ventricle torn, the pumping action working against physics, gravity, the basic mathematics of blood volume. Katie clamped across the aorta with the precision of someone for whom this was not an emergency but a procedure, a known sequence of movements that her hands could execute while her eyes catalogued the damage and her mind prepared for what came next. Direct cardiac massage. Her fingers inside the chest cavity, feeling the heart stutter beneath her touch, feeling it fight, feeling it find its rhythm again as she worked pressure in a pattern that wasn't rage but was precise as music. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. Then settled into a steady rhythm that made 3 people inhale at the same moment. The SEAL's oxygen saturation climbed. 78, 82, 87, sinus rhythm. Blood pressure holding at 105/68. The entire trauma bay had gone silent. 37 people stood frozen, watching a woman in scrubs with blood on her hands and her military bearing showing like a scar that had never quite healed, watching her step back from the gurney with the composure of someone who'd just accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. "Get him to OR," Katie said quietly. "He's stable enough to move. Vascular will need to assess the left ventricle, but you have time now. You have a window. Use it." Dr. Ashford's face went red. The transformation was instantaneous, white to crimson in the space of a single second, his hands clenching into fists, his chest expanding as if he were about to scream. But what came out was worse than a scream. It was controlled fury, the kind that came from calculation, from the understanding that his authority had just been shattered in front of his entire surgical team. "Security!" His voice cracked the words like a whip. "Remove this woman immediately. She is practicing medicine without a license. She is committing a felony in this hospital." Katie didn't resist as security approached. She'd expected this. Had understood the moment she walked back through the doors that she was making a choice that couldn't be unmade, that she was throwing off the last remnant of invisibility and stepping into something that would change the shape of her life. The seal was stable. That was the only metric that mattered. As security took her arm, as they led her away from the trauma bay and toward the holding room at the back of the emergency department, Sergeant Marcus Chen was being wheeled past on a recovery gurney. His eyes met Katie's for exactly 2 seconds. He nodded once, a nod that contained recognition and gratitude and the kind of understanding that came from shared history, from a moment 20 years ago in Ramadi when a field medic had made a choice about who was worth saving. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Ashford was already on his phone. Katie could see him through the window of the holding room, pacing, making call after call, his expression shifting into something strategic and calculated. The red had faded from his face. The panic had been replaced by something worse, the cold focus of a man who'd just realized his position was threatened and who had decided to weaponize every resource available to him. He wasn't just angry. He was constructing something. A case. A narrative. Evidence. Katie sat in the holding room and waited for the police, knowing that the next move had already been made, knowing that Dr. Ashford was at that very moment making calls to the board, to his allies, to anyone who could help him manufacture the perfect justification for having her prosecuted. She'd saved a man's life and lost her own in the process. The only question now was whether anyone would arrive in time to stop what came next. Dr. Ashford's office door closed with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid sealing. His hands trembled as he reached for the phone, not from fear, but from the cold fury of a man watching his kingdom crumble in real time. The walls around him were lined with framed credentials, photographs with senators and hospital board members, the architecture of power that he'd spent 23 years constructing. One nurse with a combat knife and muscle memory had demolished it in 4 minutes. He dialed. His voice was steady, calculated, the voice of a man who'd learned to weaponize bureaucracy the way other people wielded scalpels. "Marcus, it's Ashford. We have a situation." He waited for the board chairman to pick up. "A staff member performed an unlicensed medical procedure today. Serious criminal liability. I'm documenting everything now." The lie came smoothly because he'd already rehearsed it a dozen times in his mind during the drive back to his office, the moment the patient's chest had stabilized and security had removed Katie from the trauma bay. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the precision of a surgeon. Personnel file. Medical records. Incident reports. Each document was a brick in a wall he was building around her, not to protect patients, but to protect himself. He changed the date on her hire paperwork, added false certifications to explain gaps in her background, created phantom complaints from patients with names he pulled from the hospital directory. His computer screen glowed in the darkened office like the control panel of a machine designed to destroy careers. The story he was constructing was elegant in its simplicity. Katie Morrison was an unlicensed practitioner who'd fabricated her credentials, who'd performed surgery without authorization, who'd endangered patients. The fact that she'd saved a man's life was irrelevant. The facts he was creating were better, they were documented. They were in the system. They were unchallengeable because they existed in triplicate across 3 separate databases. He altered her background check results, added false notations to her nursing license showing disciplinary actions that had never happened, created an entire shadow history of incompetence. The phone rang. His bored allies answered one by one, their voices cautious at first, then increasingly aligned as he fed them the narrative. Criminal liability. Breach of protocol. Danger to patients. By the time he hung up the last call, he'd already heard the reassurance he needed: the board would back him. The hospital's legal team would back him. He'd made sure of that with 12 years of careful relationship building, of small favors and strategic donations, of knowing which judges' children attended the same country club as his own. What he didn't know, what his carefully constructed walls prevented him from seeing, was that the patient on the stretcher had been a Navy SEAL. That the woman he was trying to destroy had been Major Katherine Morrison for longer than he'd been a doctor. That the moment she'd walked back through the hospital doors 3 hours earlier, she'd triggered protocols that existed far above his security clearance level. Meanwhile, in the rain-soaked cemetery 14 miles from Seattle General, Katie knelt in front of a granite headstone. The letters were starting to weather after 12 years, Captain David Morrison, Green Beret, 1974 to 2011. Ramadi was carved beneath his name. Nothing else. No medals, no unit designation, no indication of what he'd actually been doing when the IED detonated under his Humvee. The military kept their classified deaths clean and simple on stone. The rain hammered down like artillery, soaking through her scrubs, running in rivulets down her face and mixing with tears she didn't bother wiping away. Her hands hung at her sides, the left one still faintly stained with blood from the thoracotomy, the right one trembling, but not from cold, not from fear, from the weight of a promise she'd just broken. "I promised you I'd keep my head down," she whispered to the headstone. Her voice was hoarse from not speaking for 3 hours. "I promised I'd stay invisible, that I'd be just another nurse in just another hospital, that I'd honor the cover they gave us by actually staying covered. But I couldn't let them die. 12 of them, David. 12 men who looked exactly like the privates and sergeants you trained. I couldn't watch them bleed out while I stood in the parking lot keeping my head down." She pressed her forehead against the cold granite. "And now I've failed us both. Everything we sacrificed, everything they told us to forget, it's all coming back. They're going to know who I am. They're going to dig into the classified sections, and they're going to find references to operations we're not supposed to talk about, and I've just handed them permission to look." The rain continued its assault on the cemetery. Katie stayed there, kneeling on the wet grass in her blood-stained scrubs, for exactly 17 minutes. She didn't notice the man in the dark sedan parked 40 yards away, engine running, watching. She didn't notice him pull out his phone with trembling hands, the kind of trembling that comes not from weakness but from the realization that you're about to change everything. Sergeant Marcus Chen, who'd followed her from the hospital parking lot because some part of him had always known this moment would come, pressed the phone to his ear and waited for someone to answer. Command answered on the 3rd ring. The voice on the other end was carefully neutral, waiting. "Sir, I've located her. I have visual confirmation." His voice cracked on the next sentence. "Major Katherine Morrison. Nightingale. She's in Norfolk, sir. She's here." The silence on the phone lasted exactly 4 seconds. "Send location." "Full scope." "Full scope, sir. She performed a field thoracotomy today. 12 casualties. All stable. All because of her. She used a knife, sir. Like Ramadi." "Understood. Stand by. Inbound." The phone disconnected. Sergeant Chen sat in his car watching the rain-soaked woman kneeling at a grave, his chest tight with the kind of emotion that soldiers spend years learning to suppress. She'd saved his life in Ramadi when he was just a 7-year-old interpreter's son, pulled him from a burning vehicle and carried him through hostile territory for 3 clicks while maintaining a tourniquet that kept him alive. The army had given her a commendation they kept classified. Then they declared her KIA to protect an asset extraction operation. Then they'd let her disappear into a hospital in Norfolk where nobody would ever think to look for a legend. 38 minutes later, the sound came first, the distinctive percussion of helicopter rotors beating air into submission. Two UH-60M Black Hawks materialized through the darkness like aircraft that had always been there, and the night sky had simply revealed them. They didn't request landing clearance. Seattle General's parking lot was suddenly transformed into a military landing zone, the rotor wash sending wheelchairs and equipment carts tumbling, setting off every car alarm in the garage. 16 SEAL operatives fast-roped from the aircraft with the smooth synchronization of men who'd done this 200 times before. 3 men in dark suits followed, moving with the particular authority of federal agents. No weapons visible. All of them lethal in ways that had nothing to do with firearms. They moved through the hospital with the kind of purpose that made security guards step aside without being told. The administrator appeared, his face already gray with the understanding that something catastrophic was unfolding in his building. They bypassed him entirely and walked into his office without knocking. The SEAL team commander, a man with silver temples and eyes the color of winter, stepped directly in front of Dr. Ashford as he sat at his desk still adjusting the last of his fabricated documentation. "Where is Nightingale?" The question wasn't asked. It was delivered. There was no question mark in it. Dr. Ashford's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. He tried to construct a response, to assert the authority of his position, to make sense of armed SEALs in his office. Nothing came out. 45 minutes earlier, Katie had walked back through the hospital's main entrance. She was still in her blood-stained scrubs. Security guards parted like water. Staff stopped mid-conversation. In the lobby, in front of the information desk and the gift shop and the rows of uncomfortable waiting room chairs, a profound silence descended, the kind of silence that happens when the world shifts on its axis and nobody yet understands what gravity is anymore. Sergeant Chen stood at attention. His uniform was immaculate despite the rain he'd driven through. His voice was crisp, military, reverent. "Major Morrison saved my life in Ramadi when I was 7 years old. She carried me for 3 kilometers under fire with a tourniquet she'd fashioned from her own equipment. The Army gave her a medal they classified so deep that I didn't know her real name until this week." He paused. The lobby was absolutely still. "My daughter's alive because of her. I'm alive because of her." A junior nurse, the one who'd entered that morning with coffee and optimism and no idea what she'd witness, was holding a hastily printed file that someone had grabbed from the secure personnel records. Her voice shook as she read. 2 silver stars. A pause. Staff members reacted. Silver stars were not things they'd heard about Major Morrison before. A bronze star with valor. The woman's voice grew stronger. 3 purple hearts. The SEAL team commander stepped forward. His voice carried the weight of command authority, of classified operations, of budget appropriations and strategic interests that sat far above hospital hierarchy. Major Katherine Morrison ran combat trauma operations in the most dangerous city in Iraq for 6 years. She was declared KIA to protect an asset extraction that saved 200 lives. Her identity was sealed under federal classification. Her medical credentials were among the highest in the military. And 2 hours ago, she performed a procedure that every trauma surgeon in this building is certified to do, and all of you were too frozen to attempt. He looked directly at where Dr. Ashford stood, having been marched back down to the lobby in handcuffs by 2 FBI agents. She did it in a hallway. Without an operating room. Without anesthesia. With a combat knife. And the patient survived. An FBI agent stepped forward, and the tone of the moment shifted from military recognition to federal jurisdiction. "Dr. Ashford, we've been investigating your personnel management practices for the past 4 hours. Your colleague reported irregularities in your documentation systems." The agent pulled a tablet from his jacket. "You have 13 fabricated incident reports on file. 7 false patient complaints filed using names that don't correspond to actual patients. You altered electronic medical records 9 separate times today, all of them related to Major Morrison, and you created false certifications in an attempt to justify termination of her employment based on imaginary credential violations." Dr. Ashford tried to speak. The agent continued, cutting him off before words could form. You did this after she saved 12 lives. You did this while standing in a hospital you're supposed to be protecting. And you did this after she'd already demonstrated clinical competence that exceeds your own qualifications in trauma medicine. The agent nodded to the 2 federal marshals who'd accompanied the SEAL team. You're under federal arrest for falsification of medical records, obstruction of justice, and attempted criminal fraud. The sound came like thunder, the metallic click of handcuffs closing around Dr. Ashford's wrists. The sound was simultaneously small and enormous, the noise that separates a man's life into before and after. Photographers appeared from nowhere. 3 news crews that had picked up chatter on police scanners. The perp walk began, and every camera in the building captured the image of the man who'd commanded absolute authority 6 hours earlier being escorted through the lobby by federal marshals while the staff he'd terrorized watched in stunned silence. Dr. Ashford's eyes found Katie's as he passed. He looked away first. 2 years later, Katie moved through the Seattle General Combat Trauma Training Center with the same measured precision she'd used to move through every corridor of every hospital she'd worked in. But the building had changed. Her name was on the wall in letters of burnished bronze, the Major Katherine Morrison Center for Emergency Combat Medicine. The space was state-of-the-art, funded by DoD contracts and veteran donations, and the kind of political will that emerges when the Pentagon decides a hospital's trauma protocols need an overhaul. She was teaching a class of 20 nurses, a mix of military personnel on educational rotation and civilian staff who'd volunteered for the Advanced Certification Program. The lecture screen behind her displayed a photograph from 2003, a younger Katie in desert fatigues, covered in dust, treating a casualty in the rubble of a bombed-out building in Ramadi. Her voice as she taught was the voice of command, steady, clear, carrying the weight of operational knowledge. Through the training center's windows, she had an unobstructed view of the main hospital. And there, pushing a maintenance cart through the lobby in a Navy security guard uniform, was Dr. Ashford. His medical license was permanently revoked. Criminal charges had resulted in probation and community service. The federal charges had been reduced to misdemeanors after his legal team worked frantically to cut a deal. But the real punishment, the thing that shaped every moment of his existence, was this: working night security in the building he'd once commanded, watching the nurses and doctors move past him with the kind of casual indifference usually reserved for furniture, knowing that his entire identity had been erased as thoroughly as he'd tried to erase hers. Katie didn't gloat. She barely noticed him anymore. After the class ended, Sergeant Chen arrived with his 7-year-old daughter. Sophia was shy, clutching a small plush toy against her chest. "Major Morrison, this is Sophia." "Sophia, this is the woman who saved Daddy's life." The little girl managed a small wave. Katie knelt down, and as she moved, her jacket shifted just enough to reveal the faded unit patch sewn into the lining. She never removed it, just stopped hiding it. "Your dad's a hero," Katie told Sophia. "And heroes help people, no matter what it costs them." That night, standing alone in the training center after everyone had left, Katie looked at her phone. The same photograph she'd kept hidden in her locker for 12 years, David in his dress uniform, smiling at something just beyond the camera's frame. "We made it through," she whispered to the image. "The truth didn't destroy us. It freed us." The words she'd spoken at the dedication ceremony were carved into a plaque on the wall behind her: "Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help." Outside the window, a trash cart squeaked across the lobby floor, pushed by a man who'd once believed his position was permanent. Katie recognized then, standing in the center named for her, surrounded by the future nurses she was shaping, watching the visual confirmation of fallen authority pushing garbage through the building he'd commanded, that the skills she carried and the truth of her identity were things that could never be erased. They were woven into her muscle memory, encoded in the pattern of her breathing, written in the lives she'd touched. The erasure had never really worked. It had only been delayed. She picked up her phone and called the DoD liaison who oversaw the training program. "We need to expand the curriculum," she said. "More surgical rotation time. More advanced procedure work. And I want more military medics coming through here." The next generation needs to know what they're actually capable of before the world tries to convince them they're invisible. The liaison agreed without hesitation. Major Katherine Morrison was not someone you said no to anymore. If you found this story powerful, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next video. Comment below, would you have saved them, or walked away? And if you have a story about being underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, I'd love to hear it in the comments.